Right now, at this very moment, a 132-foot warship is patrolling the Strait of Hormuz with zero crew on board. No captain, no sailors, no human hands on the wheel, just artificial intelligence, sensors, and a set of classified orders programmed into its digital brain before it left port, and it's doing something that should be physically impossible. It's hunting Iranian fast attack boats faster than they can hunt it. Here's the kicker. Iran has spent 2 decades perfecting swarm tactics using hundreds of small, cheap speedboats to overwhelm billion-dollar warships. It's worked spectacularly well. In 2002, a Marine general used these exact tactics in a war game and sank 16 American ships in the first day, killing thousands of virtual sailors. The Pentagon had to restart the simulation because the results were too embarrassing. But the U.S. Navy just deployed something that turns that entire playbook into scrap paper, and the truly wild part, the Iranians can see it coming. They can track it on radar, they can watch it patrol their coastline, but they can't stop it, because how do you intimidate, outmaneuver, or psychologically defeat something that doesn't have a pulse? But to understand why this changes everything, why this might be the most significant shift in naval warfare since the aircraft carrier, we need to go back to a sweltering day in the Persian Gulf, when the U.S. Navy learned a very expensive lesson about the future of combat, July 1988. The USS Vincennes, a $1.2 billion guided missile cruiser bristling with the most advanced radar and weapons systems in the world, is patrolling the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War. It's 290 meters of American steel equipped with the Aegis combat system, a technological marvel that can track and engage over 100 targets simultaneously. The Iranians, by comparison, are operating modified Swedish speedboats and fishing vessels strapped with machine guns. On paper, this shouldn't even be a contest. But here's what the U.S. Navy was learning the hard way in the confined, chaotic waters of the Persian Gulf. A $1.2 billion cruiser and a 50,000 speedboat are playing two completely different games. The Vincennes, designed to fight Soviet submarines and bombers in the open ocean, was now surrounded by dozens of small boats, civilian traffic, oil platforms, and commercial aircraft. The crew was overwhelmed, stressed, operating in an environment their ship wasn't designed for. You know how this story ends. The Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing 290 civilians, because in the chaos, the crew mistook a commercial Airbus for an attacking F-14 fighter jet. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a preview. A warning sign written in the worst possible terms. The future of naval warfare in littoral waters, that's the fancy military term for close to shore, would favor the small, the cheap, and the many over the big, the expensive, and the few. Fast forward to 2002, the Pentagon stages the Millennium Challenge, a $250 million war game designed to test America's military readiness. They put Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper, a crusty Marine veteran, in charge of the Red Force, the bad guys. His mission, defend the Persian Gulf against a full-scale U.S. invasion using tactics a country like Iran might actually employ. Van Riper looked at the U.S. Navy's force, aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, cruisers, the works, and made a calculated decision he wouldn't fight symmetrically. Instead, he gathered a simulated fleet of hundreds of small boats, pleasure craft, speedboats, fishing vessels. He loaded them with anti-ship missiles and explosives, and when the U.S. fleet sailed into the Gulf, he sent them all at once. In the span of a single simulated day, Van Riper sank 16 American ships, including an aircraft carrier. The virtual death toll exceeded 20,000 sailors. It was the most devastating defeat the U.S. Navy had suffered since Pearl Harbor, and it wasn't even close. The Pentagon's response, they paused the exercise, revived the sunken fleet, and changed the rules so the Blue Force would win. But the lesson was undeniable. Iran had figured out asymmetric warfare, and the U.S. Navy's conventional approach was catastrophically vulnerable. Each American destroyer costs roughly $1.8 billion. Each Iranian speedboat, maybe 100,000. Iran could build 18,000 suicide boats for the price of a single American warship. The math was terrifying. And this isn't theoretical. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, 21-mile-wide choke point between Iran and Oman, sees about 21 million barrels of oil pass through it every single day. That's roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. If Iran closes that strait, even temporarily, the global economy doesn't just stumble, it seizes up like an engine without oil. The US Navy had a problem. Their ships were too big, too expensive, and too vulnerable. Their crews were stressed, overworked, and making life-or-death decisions in milliseconds, and their adversary had built an entire military doctrine around exploiting those exact weaknesses. Unfortunately for the Pentagon, throwing more billion-dollar ships at the problem wasn't going to solve it. They needed something radically different, something that could match Iran's asymmetric advantage without risking American lives or breaking the defense budget. What they needed was something that shouldn't exist. Here's where things get interesting, because the solution didn't come from the Navy at all. It came from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the same slightly unhinged research division that gave us the internet, GPS, and stealth aircraft. These are the people who, when given a problem, respond with, "What if we just ignored the laws of physics?" In 2010, DARPA announced the Anti-Submarine Warfare Continuous Trail Unmanned Vessel Program, or ACTUV, which is a deeply unsexy acronym for a deeply sexy idea: build a ship that can hunt submarines autonomously for months at a time without a single human on board. Now, officially, this program was about tracking the new generation of ultra-quiet diesel-electric submarines that Russia and China were building. But look at the specifications they were asking for, and a different picture emerges. A vessel that could operate in shallow, congested waters, that could avoid collisions with commercial traffic automatically, that could make decisions without waiting for authorization from a command center, that could be built cheaply enough to produce in large numbers. You don't need a security clearance to read between those lines. They were building the counter to Iranian swarm tactics, and they were just polite enough not to say it out loud. DARPA held a competition, and two companies entered the ring. In one corner, Lockheed Martin, the 800-pound gorilla of defense contractors, builder of the F-35 and basically half of America's military hardware. In the other corner, Leidos, a company most people have never heard of, but which had been quietly building autonomous underwater vehicles and sensor systems for years. The Pentagon's smart money was on Lockheed. Leidos won, and not just won. They delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. Two phrases that appear in Pentagon procurement documents about as often as unicorn sighting and flawless execution. In 2016, they christened the first vessel the Sea Hunter, a 132-foot trimaran that looked like a stealth ship had a baby with a racing yacht. Here's the wild part. The Sea Hunter cost $23 million to build. For context, that's less than a single F-35 fighter jet. It's a rounding error compared to a destroyer, and its daily operating cost about $20,000 compared to $700,000 per day for a traditional warship, because, and this is the kicker, you don't have to pay the crew because there is no crew. But building an unmanned ship was the easy part. The hard part was teaching it not to kill anybody. See, maritime law is complicated, like really complicated. There are rules about right-of-way, collision avoidance, distress signals, territorial waters, hundreds of years of nautical tradition encoded into international law, and all of it assumes there's a human captain making judgment calls. So Leidos had to program the Sea Hunter to follow the Convention on the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea. Yes, that's a real document. It's called CIRCS, and it's basically the rules of the road for boats, while simultaneously tracking submarines, avoiding obstacles, and completing its mission. To test this, they sent the Sea Hunter from San Diego to Hawaii and back for 400 nautical miles, completely autonomous, without it ramming into a single whale, cargo ship, or confused kayaker. The vessel made thousands of collision avoidance decisions on its own, navigated shipping lanes, and arrived exactly on schedule. The Navy took one look at this and had what I can only describe as an organizational epiphany. If you could build one unmanned ship for $23 million, you could build 10 for $230 million, 20 for $460 million. For the cost of a single destroyer, you could field a fleet of 78 autonomous vessels. Suddenly, the math that favored Iran's cheap speedboat swarms started favoring something else entirely. But here's where the corporate politics get delicious. The traditional shipbuilders, the companies that have been building multi-billion-dollar crewed vessels for decades, absolutely hated this. Huntington Ingalls Industries, General Dynamics Bath Iron Works, these are companies whose entire business model depends on massive, complex warships with huge crews, and even huger price tags. An unmanned vessel that costs 1% as much and requires 0 personnel, that's not innovation to them. That's an existential threat. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill. Congressional representatives from shipbuilding districts started asking very pointed questions about crew safety and proven systems and the importance of traditional naval architecture. The Navy's response was basically, "Cool story, we're building more anyway." In 2018, the Sea Hunter was transferred from DARPA to the Office of Naval Research. In 2020, by the Sea Hunter 2, a sister ship with upgraded sensors, and then in 2021, the Navy did something that made it clear this wasn't an experiment anymore. They established Task Force 59, and that's when things went from interesting research project to, holy shit, this is actually happening. All right, let's take a breath and talk about how these things actually work, because the engineering is genuinely fascinating. Imagine you're trying to teach a teenager to drive. You don't just hand them the keys and say, figure it out. You teach them the rules. Watch for pedestrians. Red means stop. Don't drift into the other lane. Now imagine that teenager is a 145-ton trimaran with a top speed of 27 knots, and instead of pedestrians, they're avoiding supertankers, fishing boats, buoys, whales, debris, and occasionally hostile vessels that might be trying to ram them. That's basically what Leidos had to program. The Sea Hunter uses a combination of technologies: radar, LiDAR, electro-optical cameras, infrared sensors, and AIS. That's the automatic identification system that commercial ships broadcast. It's constantly building a 360-degree picture of everything around it, updating that picture multiple times per second, and running all that data through collision avoidance algorithms that would make a Tesla's autopilot look like a drunk driver by comparison. But here's my favorite detail. The ship also has hydrophones, underwater microphones, listening for the acoustic signature of submarines. It can track a diesel sub by the sound of its propellers from miles away, and it can do this continuously for 70 days without refueling. Try getting a human crew to stay alert for 70 days straight. Hell, try getting them to stay alert for 70 minutes on a midnight watch. The vessel is powered by 2 diesel generators that produce 360 kilowatts each. That's not a lot. It's roughly the output of a large industrial generator, or about 480 horsepower total. For comparison, a traditional destroyer has gas turbines producing over 100,000 horsepower. But the Sea Hunter doesn't need that kind of power, because it's not carrying armor, missiles, crew quarters, a galley, a medical bay, or any of the thousands of systems required to keep humans alive at sea. It's just sensors, computers, fuel, and propulsion. Pure function. Now here's a weird tangent that I find unreasonably entertaining. The Sea Hunter's trimaran design, that's the 3-hull configuration, was actually inspired by racing yachts and commercial ferry designs. The Australian company, Ironcate, builds high-speed ferries with similar hull configurations, and their vessels have been crossing the Bass Strait for decades without sinking, which is apparently the benchmark for good enough for the Navy. But there was really weird connection. The stability algorithms that help the Sea Hunter handle rough seas share DNA with AI technology developed for luxury superyachts. Yes, the same engineering that keeps a Russian oligarch's champagne glass from tipping over in the Mediterranean is now being used to keep autonomous warships stable in the Persian Gulf. God, I love military procurement. Oh, and remember, callers, those nautical rules I mentioned? There's a whole section about what to do when two vessels are on a collision course, and it basically comes down to the vessel on the right has right of way, unless it's a sailboat or a fishing boat with nets out, or a vessel restricted in its ability to maneuver, or it's a nightmare of exceptions and judgment calls. The Sea Hunter has all of this encoded into its decision trees, which means some poor software engineer had to sit down and teach a robot the 19th century concept of maritime courtesy. I like to imagine that engineer explaining to the AIs, okay, so if you see a sailboat, you have to yield, even though you could absolutely sink it. Yes, I know it doesn't make tactical sense. Just trust me on this one. September 2021, Bahrain, the tiny island nation in the Persian Gulf that hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. Vice Admiral Brad Cooper stands in front of a collection of unmanned vessels that look like they were pulled from a sci-fi movie set and announces the creation of Task Force 59. His mission statement is deliciously blunt: integrate unmanned systems and artificial intelligence into naval operations in the Middle East. Fast. Let's be clear about what this means. The Fifth Fleet's area of operations covers 2.5 million square miles, including the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the critically important Strait of Hormuz. It's one of the most strategically vital and volatile bodies of water on the planet, and the Navy just announced they're going to fill it with robot boats. The first deployment included the Sea Hunter and its sister ship, but also something new, smaller, more specialized unmanned surface vessels, the Devil Ray, a 36-foot autonomous boat that looks like a cigarette speedboat, the Manus T-12, even smaller, designed for surveillance and reconnaissance, and a variety of underwater drones, aerial drones, and sensor systems all networked together into what the Navy calls distributed maritime operations. By April 2022, barely 7 months later, Task Force 59 had logged over 25,000 operational hours on unmanned systems. Let me put that in perspective. That's nearly 3 years of continuous operation compressed into 7 months, across multiple platforms. They were testing these vessels harder and faster than any previous naval technology in modern history. And they weren't just sailing around in circles. These vessels were conducting real surveillance operations, tracking actual Iranian naval movements, monitoring shipping lanes, and feeding intelligence directly into the Fifth Fleet's command structure. Here's a specific example that leaked through military channels. In early 2022, an unmanned surface vessel operating near the Strait of Hormuz detected and tracked an Iranian fast attack boat that was shadowing a commercial tanker. The USV maintained surveillance for 14 hours straight, providing continuous updates on the Iranian vessel's position, speed, and behavior. When the Iranian boat eventually broke off, the USV simply continued its patrol pattern. No crew to tire out, no shift changes, no coffee breaks, just relentless, patient observation. Unfortunately for Iran, this near-constant surveillance was revealing things they'd probably prefer to keep hidden. The unmanned vessels, with their persistent monitoring and sensor fusion, that's the technical term for combining data from multiple sources, started building a comprehensive pattern of Iranian naval behavior, where they patrol, where they refuel, how they communicate, which boats are genuine fishing vessels, and which ones have been modified for military use. It's like having a security camera that never blinks, never sleeps, and costs less than a luxury car. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn, because the real test wasn't whether these vessels could patrol peacefully. It was whether they could handle the one thing Iran does better than almost anyone: hybrid warfare. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy doesn't play by traditional rules. They harass ships. They conduct aggressive maneuvers that stop just short of actual attacks. They swarm vessels with multiple small boats, testing reactions, gathering intelligence, and sending a message of, "These are our waters." In May 2021, before Task Force 59 was even officially established, Iranian speedboats swarmed the guided missile submarine USS Georgia and the guided missile cruiser USS Monterey in the Strait of Hormuz. It was textbook IRGCN intimidation. Get close, be unpredictable, make the Americans nervous. It worked because human psychology is predictable. Get enough speedboats close enough to a warship, and the crew starts making calculations. What if one of those boats has explosives? What if this is another USS Cole situation? When do we go from monitoring to defensive measures? When do we open fire? But you can't intimidate an algorithm. When Iranian speedboats approach an unmanned vessel, there's no crew to stress out. No sailors watching radar screens and wondering if today's the day they have to make a life-or-death decision. The USV's computers simply track the approaching vessels, maintain course, follow programmed escalation protocols, and relay information back to command. No fear, no hesitation, no psychological vulnerability. And that's what makes Iran's entire playbook obsolete. Their asymmetric advantage was never really about the boats themselves. It was about exploiting human psychology, human limitations, and human error. Take the humans out of the equation, and suddenly, their speedboats are just boats, small, vulnerable, and utterly ineffective at changing the behavior of an AI that couldn't care less about intimidation. But the Navy wasn't content with just matching Iran's capabilities. They wanted to leap ahead by a generation, and that meant taking everything they'd learned from the Sea Hunter and Task Force 59 and asking a very ambitious question: what if we went bigger? 2023, the Navy makes a decision that surprises exactly nobody who's been paying attention. They're not just experimenting with unmanned vessels anymore. They're building a fleet. The program is called Ghost Fleet Overlord, which is honestly the most metal name for a military project since Project Thor, and it represents a fundamental shift in naval philosophy. Not unmanned vessels as scouts or support, unmanned vessels as primary combatants. Let me break down what makes these new vessels so revolutionary, because we're not talking about incremental improvements. We're talking about a complete reimagination of what a warship can be. Remember how traditional warships are built with fixed capabilities. A destroyer is a destroyer. A submarine is a submarine. You can't just swap out the parts depending on the mission. The new generation of large unmanned surface vessels, LUSVs in Navy speak, because every damn thing needs an acronym, are built around modular payload bays. Think of them like Lego blocks for weapon systems. Need anti-submarine warfare? Plug in a towed sonar array and torpedo tubes. Need surface warfare? Add anti-ship missiles. Need mine countermeasures? Swap in the mine hunting equipment. Each vessel can be reconfigured in port in a matter of hours, not months. The Navy is literally building warships with interchangeable weapon systems like you're customizing a character in a video game. And here's the genius part. Because there's no crew, you don't need to train sailors on the new systems. You just update the software. It's a firmware patch for a warship. Traditional naval doctrine concentrates firepower on a few heavily armed platforms. An aircraft carrier, a destroyer, a submarine. You protect these massive assets because losing one is catastrophic, both strategically and politically. Nobody wants to be the admiral who lost a carrier. The Ghost Fleet Overlord program flips this entirely. Instead of one destroyer with 90 missile cells, you get 10 unmanned vessels with 9 missile cells each. Same total firepower, but now it's spread across 10 different platforms, operating 50 or 100 miles apart. Why does this matter? Because modern anti-ship missiles, the kind China and Russia are building, are designed to overwhelm a single target's defenses. You fire 20 missiles at a destroyer, and maybe 3 or 4 get through. That's enough to mission kill a billion-dollar warship, but fire 20 missiles at 10 different unmanned vessels. Now, you're only allocating 2 missiles per target, and each target's defenses can probably handle that. And even if you do sink 1 or 2 unmanned vessels, you've just spent 40 million in missiles to kill 50 million in unmanned ships. Meanwhile, the other 8 vessels are still operational and launching their own counterattacks. The math completely changes. Distributed lethality turns fleet defense from a desperate game of shoot down everything or die into a sustainable equation where losing individual units doesn't cripple your force. The Sea Hunter could operate for 70 days without refueling. The new LUSVs are designed for 95 days of continuous operations, with a range exceeding 4,500 nautical miles. But that's not even the most impressive part. Because there's no crew, these vessels don't need to return to port for crew rotation, resupply of food and water, or shore leave. A traditional destroyer might spend 6 months deployed, but within that deployment, it's constantly cycling back to friendly ports for crew welfare, maintenance, and resupply. An unmanned vessel can sit on station for 3 months straight, only breaking for refueling and munitions reload. That's persistence that simply isn't possible with crewed platforms. The Navy can establish a permanent, unblinking presence in contested waters without the logistics nightmare of sustaining human crews. Here's where it gets properly sci-fi. Each unmanned vessel isn't just gathering its own sensor data, it's sharing everything: radar tracks, sonar contacts, electronic warfare intercepts, visual observations, with every other vessel in the network in real time. The Navy calls this cooperative engagement capability, and it means that a missile fired from one ship can be guided using sensor data from a completely different ship 100 miles away. One vessel spots the target, another vessel takes the shot, and a third vessel provides mid-course guidance updates. From an enemy's perspective, this is a nightmare. You're not fighting individual ships anymore. You're fighting a distributed intelligence that sees everything, shares everything, and coordinates perfectly without needing to radio back and forth. There's no communication delay, no waiting for orders. The fleet acts as a single organism with multiple bodies. It's like fighting a hive mind, except the hive is made of warships. Okay, this is the part that makes people nervous, so let's be very clear about what these vessels can and cannot do. Current AI allows the vessels to navigate autonomously following maritime law, detect and classify surface, subsurface, and air contacts, track multiple targets simultaneously, execute defensive maneuvers, communicate with other vessels and share data, return to base if systems fail, conduct search patterns and surveillance operations. What they cannot do, at least officially, and this is written into Navy policy: fire weapons without human authorization, make engagement decisions autonomously, determine friend from foe without oversight. There's always a human in the loop for kinetic operations, always. The trigger is pulled by a person, even if that person is 500 miles away watching a screen. Now, having said that, the technology absolutely exists to make these vessels fully autonomous shooters. The sensors can identify targets faster than humans. The targeting computers can calculate firing solutions instantly. The question isn't, can we build autonomous weapons? It's, should we? And that's a conversation the Navy is having very carefully behind closed doors, because the first nation to field truly autonomous warships gains a massive tactical advantage. The second nation to field them survives. Everyone else, they're bringing swords to a drone fight. Remember, the Sea Hunter cost $23 million. The larger LUSVs cost more. Current estimates put them at $150–200 million each, but they're also 5 times larger and carry actual weapon systems. For comparison, a Arleigh Burke-class destroyer costs $21 billion. You could build 10 LUSVs for the price of 1 destroyer. You could build 50 Sea Hunter-sized vessels. And because the design is simpler, no crew quarters, no life support, no elaborate command centers, they can be built faster. The Navy has contracted with multiple shipbuilders to accelerate production, L3Harris Technologies, Austal USA, and others. These aren't traditional naval shipyards. Austal, for instance, builds high-speed commercial ferries and fast transport catamarans. They're bringing commercial shipbuilding efficiency to military production. Here's a fun fact. Austal's facility in Mobile, Alabama can build an LSV in roughly 18 months from contract signing to delivery. A traditional destroyer takes 4 or 5 years. That's a production tempo the U.S. hasn't seen since World War II, when shipyards were cranking out Liberty ships and destroyers by the dozens, and the Navy is planning to build dozens. Current program requirements call for at least 8-10 large unmanned surface vessels and dozens of smaller unmanned platforms by 2028, but that's not even the most impressive part. Individual unmanned vessels are impressive. A coordinated swarm of them is terrifying. The Navy has been testing autonomous swarming, multiple unmanned vessels operating as a coordinated unit, making tactical decisions collectively based on shared data. They've demonstrated swarms of 5, 10, even 20 small unmanned boats executing complex maneuvers without human input. Think about what this means in combat. Iran sends 50 speedboats to swarm an American destroyer. The destroyer releases 30 unmanned vessels that counter-swarm with perfect coordination, autonomous collision avoidance, and networked targeting. Iran's advantage numerical superiority with cheap platforms evaporates when both sides have numerical superiority, but one side's platforms are networked, tireless, and fearless. And here's the thought-provoking part. This technology doesn't just change how navies fight, it changes what a navy is. For centuries, naval power has been about projecting national will through ships crewed by sailors. The human element was the whole point. Discipline, courage, sacrifice, these were the virtues that made navies effective. What happens when you remove that? When warfare becomes a chess game played by algorithms? When sailors become system operators in air-conditioned command centers hundreds of miles from the fighting? I don't have an answer to that, but I know the U.S. Navy has decided it would rather figure it out first than let China or Russia answer the question for them. Of course, not even this race. China revealad OTS Jaun serious unmanned vessels in 2022, and while Beijing is typically secretive about military capabilities, open-source intelligence has pieced together some impressive specifications. The Jaun class appears to be roughly similar in size to the U.S. Sea Hunter, around 40-50 meters long, but with one critical difference: it's designed from the ground up for offensive operations. Chinese military journals have published articles about using unmanned vessel swarms for saturation attacks against carrier groups. They're not being subtle about it. Their doctrine appears to be build hundreds of cheap autonomous boats, arm them with anti-ship missiles, and overwhelm American defenses with numbers. Here's what keeps Pentagon planners up at night. China has the shipbuilding capacity to actually do this. They currently build more naval tonnage in a single year than the entire U.S. Navy operates. If they pivot even a fraction of that capacity toward mass-producing unmanned vessels, they could field a fleet of hundreds within a few years, and they're not limited by the same ethical debates about autonomous weapons that slow Western development. China has explicitly stated that AI-enabled autonomous weapons are a strategic priority. They're not asking, should we? They're asking, how fast can we build them? Russia использует Marlin 350. Russia's approach is different and arguably more creative, given their limited defense budget. The Marlin 350 is a 15-meter unmanned surface vessel designed for coastal patrol, mine countermeasures, and this is the interesting part, acting as a remote weapons platform. The Marlin can be equipped with machine guns, grenade launchers, and even lightweight anti-aircraft missiles, all remotely operated. It's less autonomous than the US or Chinese vessels, relying more on human remote control, but it's also cheaper and easier to deploy in quantity. Russia has been testing these in the Black Sea and the Baltic, often in conjunction with manned vessels. Their doctrine seems to be using unmanned vessels as sacrificial scouts. Send them ahead to probe defenses, draw fire, and identify threats, while keeping crewed vessels safely behind. And then there's Iran, which finds itself facing an interesting problem. The tactics that worked brilliantly for 2 decades are suddenly obsolete. Their response has been creative. Iran has started experimenting with its own unmanned vessels, but with a twist. Rather than sophisticated autonomous systems, they're building semi-autonomous kamikaze boats, essentially speedboats loaded with explosives and guided by simple AI toward target coordinates. These aren't sophisticated, they're not networked, but they're cheap, probably under $50,000 each, and they're designed for one-way trips. Launch 100 of them simultaneously from hidden coastal positions, and even advanced naval defenses might get overwhelmed. It's the drone warfare strategy from Ukraine and Yemen, but applied to naval combat. Whether these systems will ever actually face each other in combat is, thankfully, still an open question, but the arms race is accelerating. The US is deploying unmanned vessels in the Persian Gulf right now. China is conducting extensive tests in the South China Sea. Russia is operating them in contested waters near Europe. Iran is scrambling to adapt. We're watching the opening moves of a chess game where the pieces are autonomous warships. The stakes are regional dominance, and nobody has actually read the full rulebook yet because we're writing it in real time. Fun times. So, let's pull back and look at the full arc of this story. We started with the Millennium Challenge in 2002, a war game where a Marine general proved that swarm tactics could devastate traditional naval forces. The lesson was brutal and clear in confined waters against an adversary willing to trade cheap platforms for expensive ships. The U.S. Navy was catastrophically vulnerable. 20 years later, the Navy has responded not by building bigger ships or thicker armor, but by fundamentally reimagining what naval warfare looks like. They've built vessels that don't fear, don't tire, don't hesitate, ships that can be produced in quantity without breaking the defense budget, systems that turn Iran's asymmetric advantage into a liability. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We're crossing a threshold that we can't uncross. Autonomous weapons aren't a possibility anymore. They're reality. They're patrolling the Strait of Hormuz right now, and once that genie is out of the bottle, every other military power on Earth has to adapt or accept obsolescence. The optimistic view is that unmanned systems reduce casualties by keeping sailors out of harm's way. The pessimistic view is that they lower the threshold for conflict by removing the human cost that makes nations hesitate before firing the first shot. I think the truth is probably both. Technology is never purely good or purely evil. It's a tool, and what matters is how we choose to use it. What I do know is this: the U.S. Navy launched something that fundamentally shouldn't exist according to every naval tradition going back centuries. A warship without a crew. A vessel that makes tactical decisions with silicon instead of instinct. A platform that's simultaneously less capable than a human in some ways, and vastly more capable in others. Iran can't stop it. Not because it's invincible, it's not. But because stopping it would require either matching the technology, which would take years they don't have, or abandoning the entire strategic doctrine they've built over 2 decades. And somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now, a 132-foot trimaran is cutting through dark waters with no crew on board, no flag flying, no sailors standing watch, just sensors, algorithms, and mission parameters, hunting, watching, waiting. The future of naval warfare doesn't look like another aircraft carrier or another battleship. It looks like a ghost ship that never blinks. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. If you found this interesting, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this to more people who are into military tech and geopolitics. Now I'm curious, knowing what you know now about unmanned naval warfare, do you think fully autonomous weapons are inevitable? Or do you think there's a way to keep humans in the decision loop permanently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I actually read them, and some of the best insights on this channel come from you folks. If you want more content like this, the intersection of technology, military strategy, and the future of warfare, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next week, we're diving into something equally wild: why China is building artificial islands faster than anyone can stop them, and what it means for the Pacific. Until then, stay curious.